Okay, this is my second video on the subject of class. Uh, there's this really interesting thing that happens when you ask students and, well, people in general, when you ask people to gauge what class they belong to, right, in terms of kind of wealth and income and things like that. And as you get higher up in the kind of income and wealth brackets, you find this strange thing that happens, and that's that people become quite delusional about how wealthy they are, right? So, I mean, you find people's intuitions about these things are not terribly great, all the way through. But the higher you get up, it gets really, really quite amazing. For instance, a friend of mine used to teach at McGill. She would, in her first class, where she was talking about sort of understanding your own privilege and understanding what kind of advantages you maybe got, right? She would ask the students to write down on a piece of paper, like how much your estimate of what the household income was in the home that you were growing up in, and what the a number of things, like the estimate of the how much you think the house was worth and things like that. And then she would ask them, like, do you think that you grew up sort of working class, middle class, upper middle class, or like rich? And she defined rich as quite broadly as the top 10% wealthiest people in Canada. And she's, as far as I know, she's teaching in the States now, and she says the same thing. And what's amazing is that the students at McGill University tend to be very much over very large percentage of them come from the 5 to 10%, 5%, 10% richest families in Canada. But yet, when you would ask these people, like, they would say, "No, I'm middle class," right? And even people who grew up in houses with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in income, and living in houses that were worth like a couple $1 million, they would still say, "I'm middle class," right? And if you push them on this, they would absolutely insist, like, "Oh, no, we're middle class, we're not rich," right? This is something that has puzzled me for a long time, but I think I finally sort of solved the riddle and figured out why this is the case. And now a lot of this is with the help of conversations with a friend of mine. So as it turns out, the higher you go up along the income and wealth level, the more you are likely to live in a neighborhood and move in circles where there is a huge spread between the richest and the poorest people, right? This has really fascinating kind of effects. So if you live in let's say, a poor neighborhood or a working class neighborhood, generally speaking, the gap between the richest people on the block, let's say, and the poorest people on the block is not that large, right? So it's, and on top of that, there's a lot of people congregating kind of in the middle, right? Around the mean, there's a real congregation. So, I saw this growing up in working class Verdun. The difference between, like, we were poor, we were on welfare, but like most of my friends in the building I lived in were poor and, single parent households on welfare. So I didn't feel poor, because like almost everybody I knew was in the same situation as I was, right? And the wealthiest people on the block was definitely my friend Bevan, and his dad was a prof at McGill, but they had 5 kids, and his mom didn't work, so the money was spread out over a lot of people, and they weren't like very rich or anything. They were just the wealthiest people on the block, and they weren't that wealthy, right? That, as it turns out, that's actually very much the norm. So in most working class neighborhoods, the separation between the richest people and the poorest people is not very large, and most people congregate around some sort of mean, which means that you tend to you don't have a sense sort of in terms of your day-to-day, right? Because we usually judge ourselves based on the people in our life, right? So if you're like, I don't know, 30 pounds overweight and all your friends are like 100 pounds overweight, you might feel like you're, sort of slim, right? But then if you start hanging around with people who are all like super buff and you're 30 pounds overweight, then you might start to feel really chubby in that circle, right? So we tend to judge ourselves on a million different, indicators by comparison, right? So keeping up with the Joneses and all that, right? So what happens is as you move up the income ladder, right? So as you go, for instance, from a working class neighborhood like here in Verdun, like in Montreal, like Verdun, when you go up to maybe something like the Plateau Montréal, suddenly the average household has more money, more wealth, but more importantly, the spread is larger, right? So you might have on the same block, you might have one household that has an annual income, let's say, of like $80,000 a year, right? In a house that's worth, maybe a condo that's worth like 300,000 or 400,000 a year. But on that same block, you could have a house that's worth like $1 million and somebody who's a cardiologist who's making hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s a year. All right. Now, when you go from a neighborhood like Plateau to like NDG, the wealthier parts of NDG, once again, you have not only a higher kind of average or mean of wealth in that particular area or that particular block, the spread is much larger, right? Now, if you go to very wealthy neighborhoods like Bay Durfee, Nuns Island, Westmount, the spread becomes outrageous, right? And this is why you can have people who are, by all accounts, members of the 1% richest people in North America, and yet they think they're middle class because they know people that drive Lamborghinis and have private islands and have private jets and helicopters, right? So sure, we went on a nice vacation to Italy for 3 weeks, but our neighbors, they went to a private island, right? And they flew there in their helicopter or something, right? So the higher up you get, the more likely you are to know people who are far, far wealthier than you are, which causes you to gradually become more and more distorted in your assessment of what your wealth actually is. Now, I don't think it was always like this. In fact, I think there's fairly good evidence that it was not always like this. It used to be that, well, first of all, there were less rich people, period, because wealth has actually gone up dramatically. We're all doing way, way better than we were ever doing before. There's never been such a small percentage of people who are like hunger is at an all-time historical low. We're all doing. As a middle-class person in Canada, I live better than kings did in early modern Europe on almost every single indicator. So part of it is that wealth has gone up, but it's also that increasingly we are class segregated, right? So increasingly it is becoming possible in a way that it never was before for wealthy people to sort of cloister themselves off in gated communities, private schools, where they only interact with other people from their class, right? Daniel Markowitz talks about this in the meritocracy trap, how we live right now in the most class segregated society that it's ever been. It's incredibly class segregated now. So this means that you can sort of have these distortions, whereas in the past, for various reasons, rich people just had to interact with poor people and middle class people far more. So they, generally speaking, would have had a much more realistic assessment of how the other half lives. But anyhow, that is why so many rich people think they're middle class. All right, take care. Bye for now.